Thanks. So before we get into the fun part, the games, we'll get there, we have to talk a little bit about engineering principles first. So not all companies necessarily call them principles, like for example, Amazon calls them tenets. But what are they? Here's a boring definition. An organizational belief that accelerates decision-making. Maybe that's not too helpful. Let's try with a good example that we actually heard earlier today. Probably the most famous example is move fast and break things. It has influenced our whole engineering culture, and it has made Facebook the powerhouse that it is today. So if you look at their open source contributions, they really move fast, and they help transform our whole industry with their open source products. But they also broke things like everyone's mental health. Not great. So a few years later, they actually came up with another iteration of their principle, move fast with stable infra. Yeah, you look at me like I'm making this up. Well, take out your phones, Google it. It's actually a real thing. Yeah, it's not as catchy as the original one. Anyway, let's go back and think about how do we know if an engineering principle is useful to our organization? Well, the thing is in the word useful, when it is actively being used. So when it's actually speeding up our decision-making process. Well, that is actually tough. Like a couple of years ago, I was part of a small team that should help the CTO launch our engineering values. So values are different from principles, but the same challenge applied. Like we launched it with great fanfare and on all hands. We were super excited. A few weeks later, everyone forgot about it. No one knew what they were anymore. So that's the challenge that you're also going to have. So you want to see them being used. But for that, people really need to have them at the top of their minds. So a couple of months earlier, I had this challenge that my teams, they were kind of still a few years back when we didn't have those lean times. So they saw a big problem. They saw, hey, we can build something cool engineering-wise. And they didn't really think about how many more people do I need on my team to handle that. So I wanted to get them back into a state where they are more conscious of what their teams can handle. So this is the slide I used to help to introduce this. Don't bite off more than you can chew. So before they go and take on a big, new, exciting challenge, they should actually check, is that something I can do with my team size? So I introduced that in a presentation in the morning. In the afternoon, I was in a whiteboarding session, and someone presented a great way to approach a problem, and then someone else was stepping up and saying, hey, that's a great idea, but are we maybe biting off more than we can chew here? And that was exactly what I wanted to see, like someone was using it and was speeding up the decision-making process because the other person that presented the idea immediately knew what they were referring to and understood why the idea probably wouldn't work. So yeah, it was actively used. But remember, I presented this in the morning, the other person used it in the afternoon. It was still very much on the top of their mind. So how can we get others to constantly use those principles? How can we keep them at the top of the mind? And sometimes our engineering principles are really catchy, but sometimes you got more of a move fast with stable infra, and you still need that to put on the top of people's minds. So what can we do? Repetition. And when I say repetition, I don't mean repeated once or twice. There's this thing called a rule of 7. So back in the 1930s, the data analytics team in the movie industry, don't ask me what their tech stack was back then, they discovered this rule of 7. So it says that a potential moviegoer had to see a movie poster at least 7 times before they actually go and watch the movie. And I think it's often similar for us. We have to repeat things to our organization many, many, many times over before it actually settles in and they use it. Now, you may be thinking, oh no, he's going to recommend us to use motivational posters. Those are so cringe. Don't worry, that's not where we're going. My team is mostly remote, so I can't hang up posters, right? What can I do for repetition then? Well, when do we meet? Kinda in meetings. That's maybe when I talk as well. But you quickly feel like, the safety announcement in an aircraft, kind of very repetitive. And the thing is, people don't listen anyway, and it doesn't work.
And if you're enjoying this, LeadDev has a ton more to offer.
I'm quite fond of the articles.
I feel like LeadDev blogs are my favorite, and it's been really, really useful to kind of create these more meaningful connections as well.
If there's something you're struggling with as an engineering leader, there's a pretty good chance that LeadDev has published something that addresses it.
So make sure you check out leaddev.com.
So I didn't really come up with something better, so I kind of blanked out and was like, okay, it's the best thing I can do. So one day I was planning an in-person meeting for my remote team. Some people would meet in real life for the very first time. So on my agenda, I really want to start with icebreaker games. Have some fun. Let's build a team. Next item, introduce the engineering principles, repeat the stuff I already talked about. Kind of boring, right? Then it hit me. Games are actually awesome to repeat stuff. Think about your favorite game. How many times did you play it? Did it ever get boring? Probably it didn't, because every time you play this game, it's a little bit different. Maybe you played with different people, maybe something changes. So games are awesome to repeat things. So I want to go through some of the games that I found work really well to include these engineering principles in them. And you may have heard of them before. The first one is Pictionary. So the way it works is there's one player that gets to draw something, and they get an engineering principle assigned. The other persons don't know it. The others have to guess it. So the person may go and draw something, like here a car that's maybe driving along quickly, and then it crashes into something. So maybe you can guess what this is. Move fast and break things. All right. The next game is actually a very, very old one, a charades or pantomime. So the setup is very similar, like one person is getting one principle and they have to act it out in front of the other people. So let me try it out myself and see if you can guess it. Anyone can guess? No, move fast to stable infra, because I couldn't break it. Okay, you see, the games get tricky. So here are some more practical tips. Like, basically, there are a lot of cool games out there, and you can reuse them if they're like quick, interactive, and simple to learn. If your engineering principles are new, it's probably a good idea to show them before you start playing the game so others can memorize them again. If it starts to get too easy, because you should only have a few of those principles, try to mix some other words or phrases into the game. Like, can be ideally specific to your company or something that you're in engineering are dealing with. Want to see someone pantomime microservice migration? That's your chance. If you got a bigger group, let's say 8 or more people, it's probably a good idea to try to break them down into teams. And then you can make it a little bit competitive. So one of the teams will play, the others would just watch. But if it goes for a count score, the other team will actually be hoping for that the other team doesn't succeed. So make sure to add a time limit then. And if you want to increase the competition, maybe the time that you have to guess decreases with each point that you score. Now, these games, they work great in an in-person setting. But as I said, my team is remote. So which games work in a remote setting? Well, Pictionary is something that you can play as well. It's kind of okay to draw on your laptops. But I found there are some variants that are more fun. One is the collage. So in that scenario, everybody gets an engineering principle. Well, then the cool thing is everybody can go off in parallel, search the internet for cool pictures, and try to visualize it. So who can guess what I'm trying to visualize here, which of the principles I mentioned? Don't bite, chew. Don't bite off more than you can chew. All right. So this is almost my final slide, and I didn't talk about AI yet, so I really had to put this here. So you can also do it similarly. Everybody gets one engineering principles, but then they need an AI to generate an image that describes it. And it's pretty important that you tell the AI not to just include the text and image. That will be cheating, right? So who can guess what that will be? It's move fast with stable infra. Well, thanks, ChatGPT. All right, so to wrap up, catchy phrases are good. If you create engineering principles, try to use those catchy phrases because they really help people remembering them. But that alone is unfortunately not enough. Repetition is better. You have to repeat it over and over again, but that gets boring quickly. So that's where the games come in. Games make the repetition fun. You can play games over and over again and use that to your advantage for engineering principles. Thank you.